I didn't expect my husband to serve me legal papers while I was still in pajamas. The morning light had barely crept through the blinds when Grant walked into the kitchen with a manila envelope in one hand and a steaming mug of coffee in the other. He didn't say a word, just slid the envelope across the marble counter and took a sip of the coffee I'd brewed. Before I continue narrating the story of Eliza, please consider giving this video a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. "Read it," he said flatly, as if we weren't standing in the home I'd bought 2 years before we even met. The silence between us snapped like a wire under tension when I opened the envelope and saw the title, Property Reassignment Agreement. The luxury mansion had always been mine. 12,000 square feet of ocean-facing elegance in Newport Coast, paid in full after I sold my biotech startup to a global firm. I'd spent years building that company. Blood, sweat, and more sleepless nights than I could count before cashing out at 36 and shifting into angel investing. When Grant and I met, I thought he appreciated that drive. He'd said it inspired him to push harder with his own architecture firm. Now he wanted me to sign away the estate as though it were a forgotten gym membership. "You said you wanted to simplify things," he offered, his tone rehearsed and almost bored. "This puts everything in a trust. For protection. Tax sheltering, you know?" I stared at the words on the page, legal jargon masking a silent theft. "Who's the trustee?" I asked, knowing the answer before he said it. "My cousin Nolan," he replied, eyes not meeting mine, the lie stinking up the room like soured milk. Grant had never earned my mistrust until now. He was polished, always impeccably dressed, with the kind of easy charm that made waiters remember his order and neighbors invite him to everything. But I also knew that charm came with strategy. Grant had a way of getting what he wanted without ever raising his voice. He'd talked his way into contracts, partnerships, even my heart, and now he was trying to talk me out of my legacy. The papers looked legitimate. They included references to trust law, citations from California probate code, and even the embossed letterhead of a law firm I didn't recognize. But my instincts, the same ones that had protected me through the chaos of tech funding rounds and acquisition lawyers, screamed that this wasn't just about simplifying. This was about power. And Grant had finally shown me the mask beneath the marriage. "I'm not signing anything," I said, folding the papers neatly and sliding them back across the counter. His face didn't change, but his jaw twitched just slightly, the only tell he ever had when things didn't go his way. "I figured you'd be difficult," he said, voice colder now, like he was speaking to a business liability, not a wife. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." And with that, he walked out of the kitchen, leaving his untouched coffee behind. Later that day, I called my attorney, Hannah Kim. We hadn't spoken in months, not since she helped me finalize the paperwork for a venture capital round I'd backed. She picked up on the second ring, her voice sharp and alert even in greeting. "What's going on?" she asked after I gave her the briefest outline. "I think Grant is trying to steal my house," I said, hearing the disbelief in my own voice as I said it out loud. Hannah asked me to scan and send the papers immediately. Within minutes, she was texting me a list of red flags, starting with the so-called trust being managed by a family member with no fiduciary oversight. "It's a shell maneuver," she wrote. "If you sign that, he can move the title and sell it, rent it, or take a loan out against it without your consent." I stared at the last text longer than I should have. He's not just playing dirty, he's playing final. I hadn't realized how deeply Grant's betrayal had sliced until that moment. I walked the halls of my mansion that night, barefoot, the tile cool beneath my feet. Every corner of the house had my fingerprints on it, from the custom wine cellar to the skylight reading nook I'd dreamed of since college. This wasn't just real estate. It was years of late-night planning, sacrifice, missed birthdays, and holidays. It was mine, and now Grant wanted to erase that history with a single signature. I began reviewing everything I'd ever shared with him. The house was in my name. I'd verified that on the county recorder's site. The mortgage had been paid off before we got married, but Grant had been slowly infiltrating every part of the home, adding his name to utility bills, taking over the home security system, and redirecting mail to a shared P.O. box. He was creating a paper trail, and I'd been too trusting to notice. The next morning, I met Hannah in her downtown office. She had already printed out the documents I'd emailed and placed sticky notes all over them. "Whoever drafted this knows what they're doing," she said, pointing to a clause that shifted control of the estate under the guise of estate tax efficiency. "But it's all contingent on one thing, your signature." I nodded slowly, the weight of that truth pressing down like concrete. We discussed strategies, cease and desist letters, asset freezing, even a restraining order if it escalated. But Hannah's best advice was also the simplest. Buy time. If I didn't sign, Grant had no legal right to move anything. He could posture, pressure, manipulate. But the law would be on my side until I gave him the power. So I went home, determined not to flinch. Grant had cleared out half his closet when I returned. The suits he never wore were gone, along with the monogrammed weekend bags I'd gifted him on our second anniversary. In their place was a folded copy of the document, with a new post-it note in his handwriting. "We both know this is inevitable." I tore it in half without reading. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. That night, I slept in the guest room, with the door locked and my phone under the pillow. The master suite felt tainted now, like Grant's cologne was soaked into the walls along with his betrayal. I barely slept, my mind looping through timelines and details, trying to reconstruct every subtle warning sign I'd ignored. Somewhere between 2 and 4 a.m., I remembered the insurance documents we'd updated after our trip to Barcelona last year. He'd convinced me to name him secondary beneficiary in case of emergencies, and I'd agreed without hesitation. By morning, Hannah had looped in her colleague David Castillo, a forensic accountant who specialized in high-net-worth divorces. He had a quiet, methodical energy that immediately made me feel safer, like I'd hired the financial equivalent of a bomb diffuser. David began tracing every transaction linked to our accounts, flagging unusual patterns that stretched back almost 9 months. "Your joint account started showing withdrawals that don't match any purchases you made," he said, adjusting his glasses as he tapped at his tablet. "Looks like he's been stockpiling cash somewhere, or worse, building a fund to litigate you with your own money." I sat across from David and Hannah in their glass-walled conference room, the city humming behind them like white noise. On the table between us were stacks of folders, post-it notes, and a yellow legal pad where Hannah had sketched out a basic timeline. "Grant's play here isn't emotional," she said firmly. "It's logistical, which makes him dangerous, not desperate." David nodded without looking up. "And he's got a head start on you by at least 6 months. That was when I stopped seeing him as my husband. The word didn't fit anymore, not when he was planning a corporate-style takeover of my life. I couldn't think of him as someone I once loved, only as a man who'd embedded himself into my world like malware. He hadn't asked for a divorce, hadn't shouted or stormed out, hadn't cried or apologized. He was calm because he thought he'd already won. Back at home, Grant was gone again, claiming he had a meeting with a prospective client in Napa. He didn't ask where I'd been, didn't care that I hadn't replied to his text the night before. In his mind, I was already a formality, a name on a deed he believed he could rewrite. I walked through the house slowly, documenting everything with my phone, narrating each room like I was filming a deposition. "This is the original deed," I said, zooming in on the framed copy in my office. "Purchased in full, July 17th, 2017, under my name only." I dug deeper, pulling out tax records, maintenance logs, and emails from vendors who had always dealt directly with me. The house might have had both of our names on the mailbox, but legally and financially, it had always been mine. Grant didn't even know where I kept the backup keys or which company serviced the HVAC system every spring. He'd once called me from the driveway because he couldn't remember the alarm code. That's how removed he was from the home he was now trying to claim. Hannah filed the preliminary injunction within 48 hours. It barred Grant from making any changes to the property's title, financials, or access while we gathered evidence. "You're lucky he hasn't moved faster," she said, tapping her pen against the table. "Men like him usually get sloppy when they think they're smarter than the system," David added quietly, "or when they think they're smarter than the woman they married." I began setting traps, subtle ones. Fake folders labeled equity transfer and private sale inquiry, placed on my desktop and left just barely open. If Grant snooped, he'd find nothing but doctored files, filled with legally meaningless numbers and outdated PDFs. I was baiting him, and I hated that I had to, but Hannah assured me it was necessary. "If he tries to use anything he finds, We'll know where he got it, and he'll prove intent to defraud. On the third day, the alarm company called me. Grant had requested admin access to the security system, including door logs and camera feeds. He claimed to be the homeowner, but the representative flagged the request after seeing the property registered under my LLC. "Do you want us to lock him out?" they asked. "Not yet," I replied, watching from the upstairs window as his car pulled into the driveway. He walked in like he always did, keys jangling, humming something under his breath. I stayed seated at the kitchen island, laptop open, pretending to be buried in emails. "Hey," he said casually, like nothing had changed, like he hadn't just tried to reroute the power of attorney behind my back. I nodded once and returned to typing. My silence seemed to irritate him more than any confrontation ever could. "I think we should revisit the trust conversation," he said, placing his phone face down on the counter. I could hear the rehearsed pitch coming, the fake concern, the faux financial logic he thought I'd fall for again. "I've had some expert advice," he continued, "and they all say this structure could really benefit us both long-term." I finally looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Do your experts usually commit mail fraud and identity theft in the process?" He blinked once, then smiled like he hadn't heard me, as if pretending my words didn't exist could erase them. "Look, we don't need to make this messy," he said, his voice softening into its usual calculated charm. "I just want what's fair." "You want what's unearned," I replied, folding my arms. "You want to take what I built while you played pretend CEO in athleisure wear." Grant's eyes narrowed. "That's not true," he said quietly, almost hurt. But I could see the edge creeping back into his tone. "I don't need to argue," I said, standing. "I need you to understand something clearly. You will not win." His smile vanished. And for the first time since this began, he didn't have a comeback. He turned and walked out, his silence thundering louder than any slammed door. 3 days later, a white envelope arrived in the mailbox addressed to the Grant Jessica residence. At first, I thought it was a marketing fluke, some botched mailing list entry, until I flipped it over and saw the return address, a luxury real estate agency in Orange County. Jessica. The name slapped the air out of my lungs like a sucker punch in slow motion. Grant hadn't just been planning to steal my house. He'd already started preparing it for his next act. I opened the envelope with gloved fingers, my pulse hammering in my ears. Inside was a glossy brochure featuring staged photos of my home. Not digitally recreated mock-ups, but actual shots of my kitchen, my bedroom, even my meditation alcove. I hadn't authorized a single photo, let alone an open house. The text described the estate as a recent acquisition undergoing trust reassignment, with full transfer of occupancy pending. There it was, proof of intent to defraud, printed on satin cardstock and mailed straight to me. I scanned every page and sent it to Hannah and David. Within the hour, Hannah called me, her voice tight and cold. "This is enough to initiate a fraud complaint and a temporary restraining order," she said. "He's showing your property publicly, implying ownership and misrepresenting the trust's legitimacy to third parties." David's follow-up email confirmed what I already suspected. The agency had received staged access via a forged lease agreement. "I'm filing the motion now," Hannah said, fingers already flying over her keyboard. "We're also going to subpoena the agency and their photographer. If they enter the property without your consent, we have grounds for civil damages." Her voice had that edge again, the one I now knew meant something sharp was about to be set in motion. "We're also tagging this to your LLC's IP filings, since some of the art featured is original commission tied to your company." Even my walls had more protection than Grant realized. While the lawyers handled the legal perimeter, I called in my sister, Lila. She was a logistics manager by trade and a former Navy supply officer, which meant chaos was just a puzzle she hadn't solved yet. When I explained the situation, she didn't gasp or question. She simply asked, "What do you need, packed, secured, or bugged?" Lila arrived the next day with labeled bins, a fireproof lockbox, and 2 burner phones. "I brought backup Wi-Fi and cloud storage drives," she said calmly. because people like Grant always think deleting is the same as erasing. Together, we audited every room. My grandmother's jewelry box was still in the closet safe, but several heirloom rings had been replaced with cheap replicas, cubic zirconia pretending to be diamonds. Lila cataloged the changes while I traced a missing pearl brooch back to a pawnshop listing under Grant's full name. He hadn't even used a fake ID. That's how confident he was that I wouldn't look, wouldn't check, wouldn't fight. "I'm going to kill him," Lila muttered, snapping a photo of the listing on her phone. "You're not," I said, even though I didn't entirely believe it myself. "We're going to make sure he never sees the inside of a luxury home again, not even as a guest." Lila smirked, a dangerous glint in her eye. "Good. I was hoping you'd say that." The next morning, Grant showed up unexpectedly. I was in the solarium, going over Hannah's affidavit drafts when I heard the front door open. He hadn't knocked, hadn't called, just used his key like nothing had changed. He stood in the entryway in designer jeans and a smug expression, holding a bottle of champagne. "You ready to talk like grown-ups yet?" he asked, lifting the bottle like a peace offering. Lila appeared from the kitchen before I could answer, arms crossed and stance squared. Grant's expression faltered for a moment before slipping back into arrogance. "I didn't realize we had company," he said, eyes flicking over her like she was an uninvited +1. "This is my sister," I said flatly. "She's here to make sure you don't walk out with anything that isn't yours." "You think I'm some kind of thief?" he said, laughing, but the twitch in his jaw betrayed the facade. "No," I replied, standing. "I think you're a fraud, and I have the brochure to prove it." His smile collapsed like wet plaster, and for the first time he didn't know where to look. "You broke into my house with a photographer," I continued. "You tried to list a property you don't own, using paperwork you forged while sleeping with a woman wearing my jewelry." Grant's mouth opened, but Lila stepped forward before he could speak. "You should leave now," she said, her voice low and clear. "If you stay, the police will meet you before the champagne goes flat." Grant took a breath like he wanted to argue, then thought better of it. He set the bottle on the console table, one I'd custom designed for that exact corner, and walked out without another word. I followed him to the porch and locked the door behind him. This time, I didn't watch him go. I was too busy texting Hannah. "He's trespassing, and I want that restraining order expedited." By noon, the motion had been filed and the temporary order granted. It was delivered via process server to Grant's downtown office, where he'd apparently been entertaining potential clients in a conference room he didn't actually lease. Hannah called laughing about it later, telling me he'd tried to claim mistaken identity until they showed him the printed photos from the real estate brochure. "You should have seen his face," she said, still chuckling. "He looked like a dog caught chewing up a signed check, guilty and somehow still entitled." With the restraining order in place, I had the locks changed again, this time switching to biometric-only access. Lila stayed for another week, helping me install cameras, cloud backups, and redundancy systems Grant would never penetrate. "Are you going to tell Mom?" she asked one night, both of us on the balcony with matching mugs of tea. "Not until it's over," I replied, watching the ocean light stretch across the waves like a promise. She'd worry, and I need focus, not phone calls about crystals and moon water rituals. The police called me 2 days later to confirm Grant had violated the restraining order. He'd returned to the property while I was out, claiming he'd left a laptop charger and needed to retrieve it. The security cameras caught everything. Him trying to unlock the door, failing, then jiggling the side gate before giving up. Even worse, he'd brought Jessica with him, and she was the one who looked directly into the camera and flipped it off. Their audacity wasn't just infuriating, it was evidence. Hannah submitted the footage as part of a motion to escalate the restraining order to a formal eviction. "This is no longer about property," she said, voice clipped as she reviewed the incident report. "This is about intimidation and control." I nodded silently, my stomach twisting at the idea that Grant still believed he had some kind of authority over my life. He was trying to rattle me, but he'd underestimated how far I was willing to go. That night, I removed every trace of his presence. The framed wedding photo in the hallway came down first, followed by the print he'd chosen for the staircase landing. I threw out his old cologne bottles, even the one I used to love, and boxed up his clothes still lingering in the guest closet. Lila helped me wipe his fingerprint from every biometric setting on the smart home panel. It was methodical, almost surgical, like extracting a tumor that had embedded itself too deeply. I started sleeping in the master suite again. The sheets were new, the lighting adjusted, and the familiar scent of eucalyptus from my old diffuser filled the air. It felt like reclaiming something sacred. Not just a space, but a sense of peace I hadn't realized was gone. The silence no longer felt eerie or heavy. It felt earned. David sent me an email marked urgent the next morning. He'd uncovered a hidden account Grant had opened under a shell LLC registered in Nevada. The LLC had been receiving monthly wire transfers from our joint account, small enough to avoid flagging, but consistent. He traced the payments back 6 months, totaling over $42,000. Classic siphoning, David wrote. Enough to fund a getaway, rent a new place, or buy silence. Attached to the email was a PDF showing wire details, account summaries, and a snapshot of a reservation under the LLC's name for a luxury suite in Palm Springs. The date matched the weekend Grant had claimed he was attending a, quote, men's wellness retreat. I remembered that weekend. He'd come back tan, relaxed, and oddly generous. Cooked dinner, lit candles, played that same jazz playlist on repeat. He was celebrating, I realized now, but not with me. Hannah filed a subpoena to freeze the Nevada account. She also began building a secondary case, one focused not on property, but financial abuse. Grant hadn't just tried to take what was mine. He'd been funneling away money under my nose. That changed the legal terrain entirely. Now we were talking restitution. Lila brought over a document scanner, and we spent the afternoon uploading every receipt, invoice, and payment confirmation we could find. There were emails from Grant asking me to cover temporary cash flow issues for his firm. There were Venmo logs of him paying Jessica for marketing services, with heart emojis in the memo line. There was even a dinner charge at a 5-star restaurant during a week he told me he was in New York for business. He hadn't even been out of the county. When Hannah's paralegal compiled everything into a chronological binder, it spanned nearly 200 pages. This is a pattern of calculated extraction, she said during our next meeting. He used your assets to construct a fantasy lifestyle, and now he's trying to keep the fantasy after you cut him off. She laid out the steps in order: freeze the accounts, file the civil suit, serve formal eviction, and alert the district attorney's office. He wants war, she said plainly. Let's give him paperwork. Grant's response came in the form of an Instagram post the following morning. He was photographed standing on a beach with a cryptic caption, "You never know someone until money's involved. Some people choose greed over love." Lila forwarded it to me with a single word: projection. Within the hour, I'd received 3 messages from mutual friends, all asking if I was okay and if the post was about me. I didn't answer any of them. The next day, the process server arrived at Grant's temporary office. He accepted the civil suit papers with a smirk, according to the report, and asked if the server wanted a selfie for court. That arrogance was exactly what Hannah predicted. People like Grant didn't crumble immediately. They unraveled in public. And with each unraveling, they handed us more rope. By the end of the week, Grant's new social media bio read, "Architect, visionary, advocate for men's financial equality." He joined some men's rights groups online, trying to paint himself as the victim of a powerful woman who weaponized her wealth. I should have been furious. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Let him scream into the void while we built the wall of facts around him. Lila noticed something on one of Jessica's tagged photos, a wristwatch in the corner of the frame, half obscured by her cocktail glass. It was the Rolex I'd gifted Grant for his 40th, inscribed with the words, "For every late night and early morning," a watch he claimed he'd misplaced 2 months ago while golfing with clients. I zoomed in on the engraving and screenshot it. Another lie. Another receipt. David added it to the inventory of assets to reclaim. The Rolex alone was worth $18,000. Combine that with the jewelry, the siphoned funds, and the misused property. and the damage estimate crossed 6 figures. "He may not go to jail," Hannah said carefully, "but he's going to wish he had." The justice system was slow, but it was moving, and it was aimed squarely at him. Jessica posted a video 2 days later that changed everything. In it, she laughed into the camera, swirling wine in a glass too large for the table she sat at, her voice slurred but smug. "I told him he should have just married rich sooner," she giggled, glancing off-screen towards someone I could only assume was Grant. Then, as if bragging to her audience of 14,000 followers, she added, "And don't worry, soon it'll all be in my name anyway." That clip would become Exhibit A. Lila sent the link to me in a fury, her caption reading simply, "You're not going to believe this drunk confession." I watched it twice to be sure I wasn't misunderstanding. Jessica was clearly referencing the house, which she still believed was in some phase of transfer to her or Grant. It proved not only collusion, but intention. Jessica knew about the fraud, even joked about the outcome. It also meant she could be named in the civil suit. Hannah's office moved quickly, requesting a copy of the full video from Instagram via a legal notice. In the meantime, her paralegal downloaded and archived the footage along with metadata showing when and where it was posted. "That little smirk just cost her immunity," Hannah said, watching the clip play on repeat during our meeting. "Accessory to fraudulent conveyance is going to be the charge we file." I didn't respond. I was still staring at Jessica's face, wondering what made her so certain she'd already won. That night, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. It read, "You think you're clever, but you're just bitter. You'll die alone in that big, empty house." There was no name, but I didn't need one. I'd heard that cadence before, the rhythm of condescension dressed up as pity. Grant had finally run out of legal weapons. Now he was resorting to words. I forwarded the message to Hannah and the police, who logged it as a violation of the restraining order. "Keep documenting everything," she reminded me, "even if it feels petty or small." Lila installed a new security app on my phone that captured screenshots automatically and logged GPS location. We weren't leaving anything to chance anymore. Grant wanted a war. I was giving him a record. Jessica's Instagram went quiet after the legal notice hit. She posted a photo of a blank wall with a caption about toxic energy ruining blessings. The comments section exploded with speculation, followers asking if she and Grant had broken up. Someone tagged a gossip blog that specialized in influencer scandals, and within hours, the story had traction. "Fitness influencer involved in fraud scheme with married man," the headline read. I didn't know whether to laugh or sigh when my assistant emailed me the link the next morning. It included side-by-side photos of Jessica wearing my jewelry and lounging on furniture she didn't own. The internet had already decided she was guilty, and public sympathy was leaning my way. But I knew better than to rely on strangers for justice. The court would decide that, not hashtags. A week passed without a word from Grant. Then a certified letter arrived, addressed to Mrs. Eliza Raymond-Worthington. The name alone stopped me cold. My full legal name, used only on my trust documents and business registrations. Inside was a 4-paragraph proposal, typed in Times New Roman and printed on cheap paper. Grant was trying to settle. He offered to walk away if I agreed not to pursue further litigation. In exchange, he wanted $150,000 to cover business losses and relocation costs. He framed it as a clean break, a, quote, respectful parting of ways, as if I owed him closure. The nerve of it stunned me into silence. He thought I'd pay him to disappear. Hannah scanned the letter and added it to the growing stack of evidence. "This is extortion disguised as generosity," she said, her tone colder than usual. "He's playing defense now, trying to salvage what little reputation he has left." I asked if we needed to respond, but she shook her head. "Let him sweat. The DA will reach out soon enough." The call from the district attorney came 3 days later. David and Hannah were both patched into the meeting, which took place over a secure Zoom line. The DA's voice was calm, precise, and utterly without sympathy. "We've reviewed the compiled evidence and determined that Mr. Grant Worthington knowingly engaged in a pattern of financial deception, fraudulent conveyance, and property misrepresentation," he said. Formal charges would be filed within the week. That evening, I opened the wine I'd been saving since my last company's IPO. It was a vintage Cabernet I'd purchased on a trip to Napa with Lila, long before Grant was ever in the picture. We toasted on the balcony, the city lights sparkling beneath us, the silence of peace beginning to settle. "You're winning," Lila said, watching my face carefully. But I shook my head gently. "I'm reclaiming." A news alert popped up on my phone just before midnight. Local architect facing fraud charges in high-profile estate battle. The article included a blurry photo of Grant walking into the courthouse, shielding his face with a manila folder. I didn't forward the link to anyone. I just saved it to a folder labeled Closure. By the end of the week, Jessica had deleted all traces of Grant from her social media. No more beach selfies, no more wine-soaked captions about stepping into abundance. The influencer world moved quickly, and she pivoted her narrative to one of betrayal and self-discovery. A rebrand, Lila called it, from side piece to survivor. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Grant's lawyer sent one last email before his arraignment. A desperate plea disguised as a legal offer. Drop the civil suit, and he'd waive all claims to marital assets. We declined. The suit wasn't about negotiation anymore. It was about consequence. Before I narrate what happens next, kindly let me know what city or country you're watching from and why you haven't subscribed yet. The arraignment was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, and the courthouse buzzed with reporters before the doors even opened. I arrived with Hannah and David, slipping through a side entrance to avoid the cameras. Lila insisted on coming too, standing tall beside me in her navy blazer like a shield. The press shouted questions about the mansion, their microphones thrust forward as though my silence could be broken with volume, but I kept my head high, walking as though the noise belonged to someone else's life. Inside, Grant was already seated at the defense table. He wore a suit I didn't recognize, probably borrowed or rented, and his hair looked uncharacteristically flat without the expensive pomade. Jessica was nowhere in sight. She'd abandoned him as soon as the gossip cycle turned against her. His new attorney, an older man with steel-framed glasses, whispered furiously into his ear. Grant stared straight ahead, refusing to look at me. The judge read the charges slowly, each one heavier than the last. Fraudulent conveyance, attempted misappropriation of assets, identity misrepresentation, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. Grant pled not guilty, his voice steady but too loud, like a man trying to convince himself. The judge set the trial date and reminded him of the restraining order still in effect. I watched his hands tighten on the table, knuckles whitening until the veins stood out like ridges. This was the first time I'd seen him without control, and it startled me. The man who once orchestrated every dinner party and charmed every waiter looked small under fluorescent lights. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed again. One asked if I planned to sell the mansion after the trial. Another shouted whether I'd testify about Jessica's involvement. I said nothing, but Hannah answered calmly. My client will allow the legal process to speak for her. Her words carried weight, firm, unshakable, undeniable. That night, I sat alone in the master suite, with the court documents spread across my bed. The silence felt different now, filled not with dread, but with confirmation. Every charge was a brick in the wall between Grant and me, sealing the divide he had tried to exploit. Lila texted me from her apartment. "He can't touch you anymore. Remember that." I stared at those words until my eyes burned. David called the next morning with another discovery. Grant had been using the Nevada Shell LLC to attempt short-term rental listings of the mansion. The listings hadn't gone live yet, but drafts were saved on the platform under his email. Intent plus preparation, David said flatly. Even without actual bookings, this strengthens the fraud case. Hannah added the evidence to our file and smirked when she saw the listing photos. "They're the same images from that brochure you received," she said. He didn't even bother to change the captions. Sloppy work from a man who once prided himself on appearances, sloppiness that would hang him in court. Meanwhile, Jessica resurfaced online with a half-hearted apology video. She claimed she had been misled by someone she trusted and was focused on healing and personal growth. The comments were brutal, filled with accusations and memes mocking her past captions. She ended the video by announcing a hiatus from social media. I doubted it would last, but I didn't care. She was already irrelevant. Grant's attempts to control the narrative backfired too. A local business journal published an exposé detailing his failed projects and unpaid debts. Former colleagues came forward with stories of unpaid invoices and broken promises. One even claimed Grant had stolen design drafts and presented them as his own. His reputation in the architecture community was finished before the trial even began. At home, I began rebuilding. I repainted the solarium, replaced the furniture in the guest rooms, and opened the curtains Grant had always kept closed. The house felt lighter, as if it too was relieved to shed his shadow. Each change was small but symbolic, reclaiming what he had tried to make his. For the first time in months, I caught myself smiling without effort. Lila visited often, bringing meals and practical advice. She teased me about turning the dining room into a legal war room, papers and binders spread across the polished wood table, but she never complained. Instead, brewing coffee and organizing files while I drafted statements. "You're steadier now," she remarked one evening, watching me sort documents. "Like you finally remembered who you are." I nodded, though I wasn't sure how to explain it. It wasn't just about remembering, it was about rebuilding. Grant had forced me to confront the foundation of my life, and I realized it was stronger than I thought. He had chipped at the walls, but the structure held. And now, I was reinforcing every beam. 2 weeks before trial, Hannah prepared me for testimony. We rehearsed possible questions, strategies, and cross-examinations. She warned me that Grant's attorney might try to paint me as controlling, too independent, or dismissive of Grant's role in our marriage. I laughed bitterly at that. "If independence is a crime," I said, "then I'm guilty." David assured me the numbers would speak louder than opinions. He had compiled charts, graphs, and timelines mapping every dollar Grant had taken. The financial picture was devastating. Hundreds of thousands siphoned, gifts pawned, and fake business expenses disguised as ventures. "No jury is going to sympathize with him once they see this," David promised. "He wasn't a partner. He was a parasite." The night before the trial began, I sat on the balcony with Lila again. We shared a bottle of wine and listened to the ocean waves crash against the shore. She reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. "No matter what happens tomorrow," she said, "you've already won." I didn't answer, but I held her hand until the bottle ran dry. The trial began on a Monday morning under a sky that threatened rain. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, their cameras flashing as I walked in, flanked by Hannah and Lila. Grant arrived separately, his new attorney guiding him quickly through the side entrance, avoiding the swarm of questions. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation, every spectator whispering as though they already knew the outcome. The bailiff called the room to order, and the judge entered, her gavel striking like a thunderclap. Hannah opened our case with calm precision. She laid out the timeline of Grant's deceit, the forged trust papers, the staged real estate listings, and the siphoned funds. David's charts and graphs filled the projector screen, each slide stacking evidence higher against him. Every number told the same story. Grant had been systematically draining resources and plotting to seize property he never owned. The jury listened, some leaning forward as if they couldn't believe the audacity. When it was Grant's turn, his attorney tried to pivot the narrative. He painted Grant as a supportive husband, overshadowed by a domineering wife. He suggested I had too much independence and that Grant had only sought a fair share of their life together. The jury shifted uncomfortably, and even the judge's eyebrows rose at the phrasing. I felt Hannah's hand on mine, steadying me before I could roll my eyes. On the second day, Grant finally testified. He spoke with rehearsed sincerity, claiming he'd sacrificed his own career to maintain our home and support my ventures. He insisted the trust papers were just a misunderstood proposal, not fraud. But under cross-examination, Hannah dismantled him, piece by piece. She forced him to admit he hadn't paid a single household bill in years. She showed him the screenshots of his short-term rental drafts and asked why he'd listed my property without consent. Grant stammered, his face flushing as he mumbled about exploring options. The jury's eyes tracked every word, their skepticism growing heavier with each stumble. Then, Hannah played the clip of Jessica bragging about the house becoming hers. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Grant's attorney objected, but the judge overruled him. "Context is relevant," she said firmly, allowing the jury to watch Jessica's smirk and careless confession. Grant's composure cracked then, his jaw tight and his hands trembling on the table. He tried to blame Jessica, claiming she, quote, exaggerated for attention. But it was too late. The damage was done. Layla sat behind me through every session, her presence like a lighthouse in the storm. She never spoke in court, but her steady gaze reminded me I wasn't alone. At breaks, she handed me water, tissues, or just a quiet nod of reassurance. "You're doing better than I expected," she whispered once. "I didn't realize how strong you'd become." By the fourth day, the defense had little left to argue. They called one of Grant's so-called business partners, who quickly admitted under oath that no contracts ever existed. Another witness, a real estate agent, confirmed Grant had approached them with fraudulent documents. Every testimony tightened the noose around him. Even Grant's attorney seemed resigned, his questions growing shorter and less convincing. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous. Grant was found guilty of fraudulent conveyance, identity misrepresentation, and attempted real estate fraud. The judge's voice was clear and unwavering as she read the charges. Grant sat motionless, his face drained of all the arrogance he once carried. Sentencing was scheduled for a later date, but the restraining order was extended indefinitely. The judge also granted immediate restitution, requiring Grant to return or pay for every stolen item. That included the Rolex, the jewelry, and the funds siphoned into his Nevada account. Hannah leaned toward me and whispered, "This is better than I hoped." For the first time, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed again. This time I stopped briefly, standing tall as microphones surrounded me. "I trusted someone who chose deceit over partnership," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But the truth has a way of surfacing, and today it did." Then I walked away, refusing to answer another word. That night, the house felt alive again. I opened every curtain, every window, letting the salty air flow through the halls. The silence carried no threat now, only peace. Lila stayed for dinner, and we laughed for the first time in weeks. The mansion wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was home. Later, I sat at my desk and opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, I wrote, "Reclamation Project." It wasn't about revenge or even justice anymore. It was about rebuilding what was mine. Not just the estate, but the life Grant had tried to rewrite. And this time, I would design it without compromise. The weeks after the verdict were quieter than I expected. No more late-night texts, no more trespassing attempts, no more manipulative letters disguised as proposals. The mansion finally belonged only to me again, and the silence was healing instead of haunting. Still, I knew sentencing day loomed like a storm on the horizon. Grant's choices weren't finished echoing yet. David stayed in touch regularly, updating me on the restitution process. He'd begun recovering funds from the frozen Nevada account and tracing sales of my jewelry through pawn shops. Some pieces were retrieved, others compensated through valuation. The Rolex surprisingly turned up at a high-end reseller in Los Angeles. "It's almost poetic," David said. "He pawned the symbol of your trust for quick cash." Hannah prepared me for sentencing just as thoroughly as she had for trial. "He'll try to frame himself as remorseful," she warned. "He might even cry, but don't let that shake you." Her voice was steady, a reminder that emotion could be weaponized just as much as forged documents. I promised myself I wouldn't look away this time. Lila came by the night before court with takeout and a bottle of champagne. "You need to eat, not just rehearse," she said firmly, sliding cartons of noodles across the table. We ate in the dining room where the trial binders still sat stacked like trophies. "You're closing a chapter," she reminded me, "and he's about to start one he can't rewrite." The sentencing hearing drew another wave of reporters, though smaller than before. Inside the courtroom, Grant looked thinner, his once flawless suits hanging looser on his frame. His attorney tried one last time to argue for leniency, citing Grant's emotional stress and lack of criminal history. But the judge was unmoved, her words clipped and sharp. This was deliberate, calculated, and sustained deceit, she declared. Grant was sentenced to 2 years in prison with eligibility for early release after 18 months. He was also ordered to repay restitution in full, totaling more than $300,000. I felt no triumph in hearing the numbers, just a deep, steady relief. The gavel struck, and the sound reverberated like the closing of a vault. Grant's shoulders slumped as deputies led him away, his arrogance finally stripped bare. Afterward, Hannah squeezed my hand and whispered, "It's done." But I knew it wasn't entirely over. The paperwork, the financial recovery, the lingering whispers in social circles, those would take time. Still, the heaviest weight had lifted. I walked out of the courthouse breathing easier than I had in months. Back at the mansion, I began a new ritual. Every evening, I'd light a single candle in the solarium and sit quietly with a notebook. Sometimes I wrote plans for renovations, other times just fragments of thoughts. It wasn't therapy, not exactly, but it felt like stitching something back together. Each page marked distance from the chaos Grant had created. Lila noticed the change in me almost immediately. "You're softer now," she said one night over dinner, "but not weaker. Steadier." I smiled, realizing she was right. For so long I had been braced for impact, waiting for the next betrayal. Now I was learning how to simply live again. The restitution process moved slowly but steadily. David kept meticulous logs, sending me updates on every dollar recovered. When the first transfer landed in my account, I stared at the confirmation screen for a long time. It wasn't about the money. It was about proof that the system could hold someone accountable, proof that I hadn't fought in vain. News about Jessica resurfaced weeks later. She had rebranded her social media again, this time as a quote-quote wellness advocate, preaching about toxic relationships. Her follower count had dropped significantly, but she still posted polished photos with captions about resilience. I ignored them at first, until one tagged article claimed she was considering a memoir. "Let her," Lila said when I showed her. "People can smell manufactured victimhood a mile away." The mansion continued to evolve as I reclaimed it. I replaced the sterile furniture Grant had favored with warm woods and soft fabrics. The reading nook became my sanctuary, flooded with morning light. I commissioned new artwork from local painters, pieces that carried no history but my own. Every change was a declaration. This is mine. One afternoon, I received an unexpected letter from Grant's brother, Matthew. He apologized for his silence during the ordeal, admitting he had been torn between loyalty and disbelief. "I didn't want to believe my brother was capable of such cruelty," he wrote. "But the evidence was undeniable, and I'm ashamed I didn't reach out sooner." He ended with a promise to testify in any future proceedings if ever needed. I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't, at least not right away. But I kept the letter, folding it carefully and tucking it into my notebook. It reminded me that even the people closest to Grant couldn't defend what he had done. That mattered more than I expected. Sometimes silence from others felt like betrayal, but this acknowledgement carried its own weight. The first true party I hosted after everything was settled felt like a rebirth. Hannah and David came, along with Lila and a few close friends. We filled the house with laughter, clinking glasses, and the smell of fresh food. It wasn't about showing off the mansion. It was about filling it with life again. Every laugh echoed through the halls, drowning out the ghosts of Grant's schemes. When everyone left, I stood alone in the foyer, the air warm with lingering joy. I thought about the girl I had been when I signed those first papers in shock, unsure of the ground under my feet. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone tempered by fire, no longer naive to manipulation, someone who knew exactly what her life was worth. Autumn arrived with crisp winds that swept the coastline, and for the first time in years I felt aligned with the season. The house no longer carried Grant's shadow in its corners, only the warmth of fresh paint and chosen furniture. Every morning, I opened the balcony doors and let the ocean air wash over the rooms like a cleansing tide. Lila visited often, bringing baked bread or homemade soup, laughing about how she'd never seen me so relaxed. "It suits you," she said once, settling into the new velvet armchair I'd chosen for the living room. I started mentoring young entrepreneurs again, something I'd neglected during the chaos with Grant. They came to the house for coffee and advice, their nervous energy reminding me of my own early days. The mansion, once a battleground, now became a place of possibility. I felt proud watching them take notes, absorbing lessons I'd earned through both success and betrayal. In giving guidance, I found another layer of healing. One evening, Hannah called with a final update on restitution. "The last appraisal has been settled," she said, her voice calm and certain. "All stolen items have been returned or reimbursed. Legally, this chapter is closed." I thanked her quietly, realizing I had nothing left to prove to anyone. Closure didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like silence, finally resting easy in my chest. Grant's name faded from headlines as quickly as it had appeared. Other scandals replaced his, and soon his story was just another archived article in the digital void. Jessica's rebranded accounts limped along, her captions carefully avoiding any reference to the past. I didn't follow, didn't check, didn't care. The part of me that once obsessed over his moves had gone dormant, replaced by peace. But the past had left me sharper. I installed new safeguards in my finances, keeping separate accounts and layered verification. Lila teased me for being paranoid, but I called it preparation. Never again would someone weave themselves into my foundation unnoticed. If trust was earned, it would be tested too. One Saturday, I drove to the storage facility where my father's books had been kept. I'd avoided it for months, afraid of finding more missing pieces. But when I unlocked the unit, everything was intact, untouched since the day I sealed it. The smell of old leather and paper filled my lungs like homecoming. I loaded box after box into the car, determined to bring them back where they belonged. Back at the mansion, the books found a new home in the library I'd created out of Grant's old gym space. The shelves stretched to the ceiling, lined now with volumes my father had cherished. I sat in the reading chair with one of his Hemingway editions and felt something tighten, then ease, in my chest. This was legacy, not the estate alone, but the continuity of memory and love. It was mine to protect, and I was finally strong enough to do it. Lila helped me host a small gathering to celebrate the library's completion. We invited only a handful of close friends, people who had stood by me through the unraveling. Wine flowed, stories were shared, and laughter curled up to the high ceilings like smoke. "Your house finally feels alive again," one friend remarked, glancing around the shelves. I smiled, knowing she was right. The night ended, with Lila and me sitting on the balcony, blankets wrapped around our shoulders. We watched the tide shimmer under the moonlight, sipping tea instead of wine. "You could have lost it all," she said quietly, not looking at me. "I almost did," I admitted, "but I didn't because I fought back." Her hand found mine, squeezing gently as if to say she had fought with me too. A month later, a letter arrived from Grant. It was postmarked from prison, written in the same arrogant handwriting I knew too well. He rambled about injustice, about how the system had been biased, about how I had ruined him. At the end, he asked if I'd consider visiting so we could find closure together. I tore it in half and dropped it in the trash. Closure wasn't his to give me. It had come through the law, through the support of Hannah, David, and Lila, through the quiet of my reclaimed home. I owed him nothing, not a visit, not forgiveness, not acknowledgement. The man I had once married was gone, replaced by someone unrecognizable, and I had no interest in resurrecting him in memory. Instead, I looked forward. Plans for the mansion expanded, a garden renovation, a guest house for visiting family, and a studio space for mentoring. Each project was a piece of rebuilding, not just walls but my own identity. This estate, once nearly stolen, would now be the foundation of a new chapter. It would be mine in every sense of the word. Lila joked about moving in permanently, and for the first time I didn't dismiss it outright. The mansion had always felt too big for one person, but now I saw it differently. It wasn't empty, it was waiting to be filled, not with Grant's fabricated illusions, but with family, love, and purpose. "Think about it," she said with a grin. "Sisters make better housemates than husbands." I laughed, the sound startling me with its ease. She was right. This place deserved voices that belonged here. It deserved people who cherished it, not exploited it. And maybe, after everything, I deserve that too. The mansion and I had both survived a siege, and now we were free to grow. Winter arrived with cool rains that softened the coastline and washed the mansion's windows clean. For the first time in years, I decorated for the season without hesitation. Garlands lined the staircase, lights twinkled across the balcony, and a tree filled the solarium with pine-scented air. Every ornament had a story, each one carefully chosen to represent my life before, during, and after the storm of Grant. This year, the house didn't feel like a stage set for appearances. It felt like home. Lila moved in temporarily, bringing her easy laughter and her stubborn insistence on making the kitchen hers. She filled the fridge with leftovers from recipes she swore she'd perfected, and every morning the smell of coffee came from her side of the house. The mansion that had once been too large now felt balanced. The quiet broken by warmth instead of tension. We fell into a rhythm, her helping with projects while I managed my investments and mentorship. Together, we made the estate feel less like a fortress and more like a living space. The restitution payments continued, each one a small reminder that justice had been served. David sent me monthly summaries, neatly organized, showing the remaining balance shrinking steadily. I never celebrated the deposits. They weren't gifts, but repayments of theft. Yet each line of accounting carried a kind of satisfaction, proof that I hadn't just survived, but prevailed. Numbers, once the battlefield Grant had tried to manipulate, had become my shield again. One evening, Hannah joined us for dinner, her rare, free night free of litigation. She marveled at the changes in the house, the warmth radiating from rooms once cold with conflict. "You've rebuilt not just a home, but a sanctuary," she said, raising her glass. Her words settled over me like affirmation I hadn't realized I craved. The lawyer who had fought every battle at my side was finally speaking to me not as a client, but as a friend. After dinner, Hannah pulled me aside to share a quiet update. Grant had filed a request for early release, citing good behavior and overcrowding. The judge denied it immediately, pointing to the pattern of deceit and the ongoing restitution. He would serve the full term, 18 months before parole could even be considered. Hearing it, I felt no triumph, only steady relief. The new year came with resolutions written not in grand declarations, but in steady choices. I signed on to fund a women's entrepreneurship program, pledging mentorship as well as capital. I expanded the library, adding a section dedicated to female authors who had inspired me. Lila convinced me to start a small garden project, where roses from our grandmother's lineage would bloom again. Each act tied me back to roots that no fraud could ever sever. Sometimes I walked the halls at night barefoot, remembering the woman who once trembled at Grant's threats. She had been afraid of silence, of signatures, of losing everything she built. Now I knew better. I had been the strength in the story all along. The mansion wasn't his victory, it was my inheritance, earned through grit and guarded by law. Every doorway whispered proof that he had never owned even a single brick. Letters still came from Grant, though I never opened them. Hannah advised me to archive them unopened for record, and I followed her guidance. Lila joked about burning them in the fireplace, but I didn't want flames touching even his words. They sat sealed in a box in my office, harmless and irrelevant. Grant's voice no longer had the power to shape my days. Spring returned with blossoms bursting across the garden, the roses finally taking root. I spent afternoons pruning, my hands dirty with soil, the air rich with renewal. The mansion's once sterile lawns transformed into living proof of resilience. Neighbors who had once watched my drama unfold now came to admire the garden. Their praise felt genuine, grounded in beauty rather than gossip. At the first garden party, I looked around at the faces filling the backyard. Hannah laughing with David near the buffet table, Lila debating with a friend about sailing routes, neighbors mingling without tension. This was what the mansion had always been meant to hold. Not fraud or betrayal, but community. Every light strung across the branches shimmered like a declaration of survival. I raised a glass quietly to myself, honoring the long road back to peace. When the sun dipped below the horizon, I slipped into the library for a moment alone. The shelves glowed in the golden hour light, Books breathing history and hope. I touched the spine of my father's Hemingway and thought of legacy again. It wasn't about the mansion or the millions. It was about endurance, choice, and reclamation. I had not just protected what was mine. I had grown stronger because of it. That night, Lila found me sitting there and joined me without a word. We sat in silence, the kind that didn't need filling, both of us staring at the shelves. Finally, she said softly, "He tried to erase you, but all he did was prove how unshakable you are." Her words landed deep, not as flattery but as truth. For the first time, I let myself believe it fully. Grant would serve his sentence, fade from relevance, and eventually vanish from the edges of my life. Jessica would chase reinvention until her audience stopped listening. But I would remain here, in the home I fought for, building something lasting. The $1 million estate was more than walls and windows. It was proof that even betrayal cannot strip away what is rightfully yours. Thank you for listening to Eliza's story. If you're yet to subscribe, please consider doing so before watching another story on the channel.